Welcome back to How to Fix Democracy, Series 4, focusing on democracy in America. Last week, we talked with Jonathan Rauch and Pete Wehner, two very prominent conservative American political thinkers, about the crisis of conversation in America, the intolerance, the divisions between right and left. They're particularly critical of the intolerance of conservatives, Trumpian conservatives, but they're also worried about the internal intolerance on the left. So the question is, how can Americans start talking to one another again? How can we make American democracy work? My guest today has given that a lot of thought. Mónica Guzmán is the author of I Never Thought of It That Way. She's, and if, Mónica, if it's fair to call you a political activist, a civic activist, you're certainly a talking activist. You're in the business of getting people to talk to one another, even if they don't necessarily agree. Is that fair? How do you think of yourself?
I think that's fair. I think that's right. You know, I'm out there just saying, hey, this is not maybe as hard as you think. And there's arguments and reasons for it that you might not have thought of. And I'm going to help you do it step by step.
Before we switch the camera on, Mónica, you told me a lovely story about how one of your son's favorite toys had been found at a Seattle hotel. You're living in Seattle. Mm-hmm. And I said to you, you're an optimist, and you shook your head and smiled. What makes you an optimist, particularly when it comes to American democracy? Because we have so many pessimists these days.
Yeah, we do. You know, I think what makes me an optimist ultimately is I find people to be the most fascinating and powerful thing that there is, and that can be both good and bad. You know, when people feel hopeless and resigned because institutions are just sinking and everything's headed in the wrong direction, I see hope because behind every institution is just people. You know, nothing is set in stone. And people can change course really quickly and in incredibly surprising ways that none of us can truly predict. So whenever someone has this, you know, prediction of doom, I'm like, yeah, no, we're just people, you know, and we cannot control each other. And that goes both ways. We can surprise each other in bad ways, and we can surprise each other in really good ways too.
Is that what democracy is then, Mónica? Just people, just millions of people trying to figure out the best way forward, figuring out how to make themselves and their neighbors happy?
Well, in the classic sense, yes, right? Democracy, I believe it's a Greek root, right?
Originally, demos, yes. We've done some shows about that too.
Right. So it's about people. It's beginning with people. It's saying what the people want is where we should look for the North Star. That's where we should go forward from there. If it's the people's will, if we can come up with a system that represents it fairly, where people see themselves represented, then we can't go wrong. That's the theory. We can't stray that far from what is ultimately good for a society if the people in it are participating in a way where their voices are actually heard and their preferences are actually recorded.
So why aren't people listening to one another, particularly on the right and the left of American politics? Why have we stopped listening?
So there's a bunch of things in the way. The way that I like to sum it up is SOS. We have sorted ourselves to be like people who are like us, which is very normal, very natural instinct. We are othering people who seem different. And then chiefly, we're siloing ourselves in spaces where we hear a lot from people who already agree with us. But even more importantly, even when we hear voices of people who disagree with us, they're usually filtered through the news organizations or whatnot that we like. And so we're getting sort of a perversion and a skewed sense of people who think differently. So all of that is making us more scared than we need to be. And it's making us exaggerate what people on the other side actually believe, which really amounts to it's making us blind. We're not seeing the world as it is. And so it's almost like what happens to a democracy when it can no longer see itself, when it's only each part only sees its part. And I think that that's the pickle we're in. And some pretty nasty things can happen. And we sort of spin out a little bit.
Yeah, and it is a nasty pickle, if that's the right way to describe it, that we're in. It's funny, Monica, you talk about people talking to themselves, these echo chambers in our culture. That's become a truism. But the funny thing about your story and your book, I never thought of it that way, is that it's triggered by your conversations with your parents, who are both like you and very unlike you. Tell me about your parents and how they've inspired your story and your work and your books.
So we're very close, myself, my brother, and my two parents, really throughout. I'm in my late 30s, and so is my brother, and yet we're still pretty close to my parents, even though we live in different parts of the country. We became citizens in the year 2000. We're Mexican immigrants, so all of us were born in Mexico. And it was in the 2000 election that it became really clear to me that my parents were Republicans. And I had just assumed, even though we'd had all these arguments, I was like, whatever, they'll be Democrats. They'll think like me, more or less. How couldn't they? You know, I was not clearly very politically inclined or sophisticated at the time. So since then, it's been a lot of knocking up against each other and recognizing that we have our values stacked in a different order for different issues on all kinds of things. I remember huge fights over welfare back in the late 90s, early 2000s, you know, what Bill Clinton did with all of that. Big arguments over abortion. My mom was a pro-life activist. I think she would describe herself that way. Started the Right to Life Club at my Catholic high school. My dad surprises a lot of people with his views on immigration. Sometimes in America, the mainstream assumption is that if you're an immigrant, you must be very liberal in your preferences for immigration policy. My dad is just the opposite. He wants the United States to enforce its laws, including immigration laws. And he doesn't have that much empathy. I mean, some, but not that much empathy for, you know, folks who might share his nation of origin, but are breaking United States laws in order to come into the country. So exploring the contours, the fault lines of my views and theirs politically over the last, you know, umpteen years has been very revealing, and really sort of like the laboratory where, in addition to my journalism career, where I've interviewed tons of people for tons of reasons, it's a great place for me to exercise, you know, this idea that you can continue to explore those intersections and see, well, why do they completely disagree here? And also, we get pretty mad at each other. I mean, it gets heated. But as I say,
shouldn't it? I mean, one of the things about
a
healthy democracy is heated argument. We feel strongly about these things. There's nothing wrong with that, is there?
Exactly. No, there isn't. And that's what I think is a misconception about this kind of work or practice or what have you, where, oh, if you want to talk to the other side, you are abandoning your convictions. You are weak. You are being nice or polite, you know, at the expense of being you. I see it as just the opposite. When you are crossing the divide every now and then, you are challenging your political beliefs. You're adding friction to your own ideas. That is democracy. That's good democracy. If we're not adding friction to our ideas, what are we doing? You know, we're not testing them. We're walking around with a lot of certainty. And we get blind about the actual kind of mix of stakeholders that a good democracy ought to bring together. I mean, the United States, as you know, we're quite a democratic experiment. We have all kinds of different people with all kinds of different origins, all in one place. This is supposed to be hard. It's supposed to be hard.
Do you think, Monica, that just as you were surprised with the fact that your parents turned out to be Republicans, they were surprised that you turned out to be a Democrat? They simply took it for granted because you were their child, that you would think like them?
Yeah, to an extent. I still remember my dad. So I went to a liberal arts college in the United States, you know, and at one point he kind of let out, man, they brainwashed you. And I was like,
where did you go to college?
to Bowdoin College in Brunswick, Maine.
That's a real
you know
liberal
it?
arts college.
Yeah, no, it's
my daughter's at Bryn Mawr, one a similar type, I think.
Okay, so you're aware. But I told them, Dad, they didn't make me liberal. I was already liberal. I was already inclined that way. Did my college have a lot more, to pull out my liberal sides than to add friction to it from a conservative side? You bet. But no, they didn't brainwash me. But I could tell that he thought, in his mind, the more reasonable path I could have taken would not have taken me so far left in my politics.
What about the issue of cultural identity, Monica? A lot of people have argued that some people are born Hispanic, some people are born African American, some people are born indigenous, some people are indeed born white American, and that defines them. You're clearly passionate about your cultural identity, as your parents are, but your politics are quite different.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So there's a lot of directions I could go with this reflection. So I guess I'll just to ask you, where should I go with that reflection? There's a lot I can say about cultural identity.
Well, that's for you. I'm not going to tell you where to go. I'm curious. There are some people, for example, who simply take it for granted, as you suggested earlier, that, for example, Hispanic Americans, if that's the right term, are by definition progressives. But that's clearly not the case, is it?
Yeah, I think it's ultimately, everybody wants to be seen and understood. For some people in some contexts, being extremely attached to a cultural identity is the vehicle to being seen and understood. But for others in some contexts, being attached to a group identity is actually the vehicle to not being seen and not being understood. And that, I think, is really the key thing. If you are a Hispanic person in a city that was probably mostly liberal and you are liberal yourself, well, maybe your group identity and how it tends to align with people's political expectations is really convenient. But if you happen to be, like my parents, Hispanic and conservative, it's annoying. It's your group identity is actually how you are misunderstood. I write in the book about a time that my dad, who's a bird photographer, ran into another bird photographer he really admires, who he recognized from Instagram, and they get to talking. And this other bird photographer insults Trump in a way that clearly assumed that my father also despised him. My father loves Trump, but he felt stuck. He felt like he couldn't correct this guy, but that these are the assumptions and expectations that surround my dad. And so I know a lot of people whose cultural identities end up being signals to many people in the wrong direction about what they're supposed to believe, which just makes me kind of say, gosh, we really should let go of these expectations. None of them are that predictable that they're worth holding on to as much as we do. So yeah, I really am more on the side of, just like with any stereotype, we don't want to go throwing those around. But again, for a lot of people in a lot of contexts, your cultural identity is how you are seen and understood. When it comes to people's expectations that identities line up with politics, that's pretty dangerous.
It's funny how the political parties have become, in a peculiar kind of way, the new ethnic group. The old question that pollsters used to ask, or public opinion people used to ask ordinary Americans 30, 40, 50 years ago is, how would you feel if your daughter or son married an African American or somebody from Mexico or some white? Now they ask them, how would you feel if your son or daughter married a Republican or a Democrat? And the degree of intolerance today when it comes to politics is, if anything, more than it was in terms of ethnicity 50 years ago.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's been Shanto Iyengar, I think, is the social scientist, who pointed out famously that a justifiable hatred in our society is political. It's unjustifiable to hate someone for their race, obviously, their gender, but their politics, sure.
But they have become mixed up. I mean, there are people, particularly on the right, I think, in America, whose politics is mixed up with racial intolerance and sometimes even hate. I mean, that's true, isn't it?
Well, I guess I'm someone who likes to slow down and examine, what do we mean by hate? What do we mean by intolerance? I think it's unquestionable that there is no one factor that influences somebody's political identity. There are obviously many. When I think of the influence of hate, I usually want to look behind that and beneath that. Because to me, when you do get curious about what looks to you like hate, you'll usually see somebody who has missed the humanity of someone else, or has missed the worthiness of someone else, and might have a lot of misperceptions about that group or that other type of person or what have you. And again, I come back to, and the more divided we get and the less we talk across difference, the worse that's going to get.
Monica, in our third series, we focused on the idea of citizenship. We did one interview with Eric Liu, who heads up Citizen University. I think he's up in Seattle too with you. You may know him.
I do.
Can this be taught? If you go to Eric's university, does it make it more likely that you're going to be able to have fearlessly curious conversations in the divided America of 2022?
Yeah, I think so. Citizen University and Eric's work shares a lot of common denominators with mine and with many others in the civic bridge building space. But to me, the core lesson, if you will, which isn't much of a lesson, is just empowerment. I think a lot of times, unless we remind each other that this is our country and that's it, that this is our country and it doesn't need to feel so distant and alienated and like we're victims of the stuff and the junk out there. Eric is very good at that and at helping people see their own power. And that's something that I want to help people see as well, that even in your own life, in your own conversations, even in conversations with yourself, you can take these steps to be more curious that are gonna add up to a lot for everybody.
Are there equivalents of Mónica Guzmán in the conservative community? As you said, you're a liberal, and unashamedly liberal, but you're also committed, both in your professional and personal life, to fearlessly curious conversations with people who don't agree with you. You're very much committed to saving American democracy. Are there many people like yourself? Again, I see somebody like Eric Liu more in the progressive camp too.
Yes. So one person that I think of immediately is John Wood Jr. He's my colleague at Braver Angels. He's an extraordinary thought leader, leader in many respects, very conservative and very dedicated to something about our union being more important than our differences. And I highly recommend people look him up. He's incredible and extraordinary and very inspiring to me. So he and I kind of, in a lot of ways, share a perspective from two different sides.
Perhaps you might say a little bit more, Monica, about Braver Angels, about your role in it and what you're trying to do.
Yeah, so Braver Angels is the largest cross-partisan nonprofit working to depolarize America, which, scary. How? But it's working. It started with methods from marriage therapy informing our signature workshops. There's all kinds of workshops and they go kind of in a chain. You start with the Depolarizing Within workshop. You go to the Red Blue workshop. You go to the Skills for Bridging the Divide, the Families Divided by Politics. All these workshops, thousands of people have taken them. And then what you learn in these workshops where you're with real people help you see different people in your own life in a fresh light. Where you go, well, I carried these assumptions about liberals or conservatives, and then I was in this workshop when I realized they were wrong. So what other assumptions do I have that are completely wrong? Let me ask more questions. So that's pretty cool. And Bravery Angels doesn't just do workshops at all. It's grown well beyond that. And one of our signature events is Bravery Angels debates. These are amazing. After I saw my first debate, I just thought, I got to find a way to get involved with these folks. There are these big debates. They happen virtually. There's hundreds of people, and we tackle seriously divisive issues, like big ones. And
like what?
Like abortion. Like the one this Thursday, actually, on Thursday, is about public health and public trust. Should experts be making, public health decisions, or should citizens be making public health decisions? And we've got amazing speakers lined up, but the structure is such that people who come and listen can actually give their own arguments. But the structure makes it so that it's really, really hard to take what anyone says personally, and they're very, very tightly moderated. So you end up learning a lot about how the other side thinks about something.
How many people are involved in Bravery Angels, and how might some of our listeners get involved?
So there's about 50,000 subscribers. So that's the community, and about 10,000 paying members. And listeners can get involved by going to braverangels.org, and that will be the home base for lots of things. We have the Bravery Angels podcast as well in our social channels, but it's a growing movement. We partner with a lot of other organizations who are doing this kind of stuff too, like Bridge USA and Living Room Conversations and lots. But what I see in it is it really is a movement. It's people saying enough. We're not going to sit around and wait for someone else to fix this. We're going to pick this up and go ourselves. Bravery Angels also has 74 local chapters all across the country in cities and towns that all have equal red-blue political leadership.
Monica, how much do you think there is a need, alongside the initiative of groups like Bravery Angels, to change the institutions of American democracy, particularly the federal institutions? Congress clearly, at best, is in crisis, at worst doesn't seem to work anymore. Do we need to replace the structures of representative democracy, perhaps, or at least supplement them with something more direct? In our third series on citizenship, we focused on citizen assemblies, which are quite popular in Europe, in Belgium, in Ireland, in Canada, less so in the United States. Do we need institutional reform alongside Bravery Angels and the work of activists like yourself?
I think so. I've always found fascinating the debate around degrees. Some folks are incrementalists and they say, no, we need to preserve as much as we can and change only what needs to change. Others are more radical or impatient and just want to, let's start over, and I don't know that I would go that far. But sometimes you really, I worked at startups for many years, and I come from sort of a tech background in my career. And in startup land, we have hackathons and people get together and go, okay, here's the problem. Let's design something from scratch. Let's have like soda and chips and pizza and just solve this. And I think if we were to sit down and recreate the American government for today, I do think that a lot of things that were around from the founding fathers were right. They've taken us this far for a reason. And there's things we ought to preserve. And I would look at that first. But then there's stuff around our elections or around campaign finance, around whose voice gets represented, in certain power dynamics that just seem off, that if we had the founding fathers here, they'd be like, the heck happened? Like, what did you all do? Or things like ranked choice voting are really compelling to me. Things like finding ways for third parties to actually have a platform are very compelling to me. But we know that systematically, it's extremely hard. I mean, these institutions have been rock solid for a long time, and to try to reform them in one fell swoop is difficult. I think it's going to take a lot of citizen awareness of what's even possible. And most of all, I think it is going to take reform of Congress. So I'll give a shout out to the Select Committee to Modernize Congress in the U.S. House of Representatives. Is an extraordinary body of 12 sitting House members, 6 Democrats, 6 Republicans. And their whole task is to come up with recommendations to make Congress less dysfunctional. And the 2 co-chairs, Derek Kilmer and Charles Timmons, are huge believers in depolarization within the body. And they've partnered with Bravery Angels and many others. They had our co-founder testify to Congress because members of Congress know that the whole body is broken. They don't enjoy the dysfunction. I think sometimes sometimes when we're feeling really cynical, we like to believe that all the politicians and everyone in big media is all like, no, they're not. Nobody likes this. So that gives me hope too, because sitting elected officials want change. It's just super hard to do it institutionally.
If you could close your eyes and make magic happen, where would you begin? Where would be the first step in fixing American democracy, in allowing people to talk to one another and encouraging the building of bridges rather than their destruction?
Yeah, here's a fun one. Being a journalist, I think of the media. Media is our storytelling institution. I think journalism needs a serious overhaul. And one fun experiment that I would run is, could every newsroom think about ideological representation, not just racial and gender representation? Could they look at that among their staff? And I'm not saying, make sure you have 50% liberal journalists, 50% conservative journalists. No. But in your leadership, are you welcoming those kinds of different perspectives? And if you do have a newsroom that has, the ideologies represented somewhere in leadership, how does that change the assumptions you make about the stories your community wants to hear or how they ought to hear them? So I would begin at the level of story, 100%. There's a great quote by Thomas Jefferson that used to be written on the wall of the Seattle Post-Intelligencer, which is a newspaper I worked at for a number of years. And I think it said, if we can have newspapers without government or government without newspapers, he said, I'd have newspapers without government. That there's just something so important about being able to tell our story to ourselves and being able to do that well. I think that if journalists get to the point where people on both sides of the divide go, we trust them equally, we trust them and distrust them equally, we're in a really good spot. That means that we've seen each other.
There are a lot of accusations, and in my sense, I think they're right, from conservatives that media is dominated by liberals. Do you think that's true? And if so, why? Not just newspapers and magazines, television stations, but also the university, the commanding intellectual heights, if you like, of our society.
Yeah. I think it's fairly clear. I wouldn't put any kind of evil spin on it, though. Being liberal, journalism was instantly very captivating to me. I think it's captivating to a lot of people, liberal and conservatives. I don't pretend to fully understand what it is that makes so many more liberals end up wanting or being in newsrooms. It could be a lot of things. It could be self-selection. It could also be the culture and the climate silently signaling to conservatives that they're not welcome. I don't know, but I think that we're at a point where we should really be conscious and aware of what all that is. Journalism has also gone through a lot of other transformations. Who is it? Batya Sangar, the Newsweek deputy opinion editor, I forget her full name, but she talks about how journalists in America, that used to be a working class job. That used to be almost blue collar, right? Nowadays, with the digital revolution, gosh, every journalist can live in New York City and LA and DC and maybe Boston and cover the whole country from there. Really? With local newspapers dying out and losing a lot of their sustainability. You can chase six-figure salaries at some of these big newspapers, and they have so much resources that they can cover everything. But we really are losing what we used to have was journalists who more naturally represented their communities, even socioeconomically. And that's less true now than it used to be. So there's a lot there that I think we need to look at where yeah, it does seem like, gosh, you got to have a 4-year college degree. There's a lot of graduate degrees. There's a lot of concentration of journalistic power in cities, which are exceedingly liberal. And so it is sort of a siloing happening there too, at the origin point of many of our stories. Now, there is, of course, a very strong conservative media tradition in the United States, but it's nowhere near as pluralistic. It doesn't cover as much ground. It doesn't have as much sort of diversity of method. And it's often reactionary. A lot of American conservative media reacts to the mainstream liberal media rather than kind of telling their own story and leaving it at that, right? So there is some kind of imbalance there that is very, very tricky and complex. And it would be fascinating to try to get to the bottom of it.
Monica, do you think that the media in America, contemporary media, particularly in the last 4 or 5 years, has become like your father's birding friend, obsessively anti-Trump, fetishizing Trump as the Antichrist, and losing any sense of reason and ability to discuss anything in a coherent way?
I think some of those things to me feel more true than others. I do think that it is unfortunate that the personality of Trump has taken so much of the oxygen and so much of the energy. That's, very, very powerful person, a very, very strong personality for lots of reasons that we can discuss. But I do think that one of the tragedies of the last several years of storytelling and political thought is that instead of talking about people, we talked about Trump. Like Trump is nothing without the support and hope of the people who saw something in him, right? And still see much in him. And I think that was really, really unfortunate. And again, brings me right back to the main theme of what I'm trying to say, which is it's all people, y'all. It's all people. You can go and look at Trump and you can miss the real story, which is people. Like, what is leading all these different folks to support someone so unconventional, if that's the way you want to see it? Or, or what is it that Trump stands for that is really good? And that became a very difficult question to ask because of everything that many people saw Trump stand for that was very bad. So bad that it threatened democracy, so bad that you have this podcast, so bad that everyone and their mother is talking about democracy hanging by a thread with January 6th happening, at the end of this man's presidency. My goodness, of course, we're very scared. So I don't necessarily blame people for having a lot of vigilance at a very anxious time. I think that's understandable.
Monica, you brought up January 6th. A couple of questions on that. Firstly, you talk about all this being about people. There were many people at those demonstrations, insurrection, whatever you want to call it. Mm-hmm. I'm curious, how traumatized were you by January 6th? Did it make you even more committed to fearlessly curious conversations, even with the people who showed up for those demonstrations? And can we get beyond it, even if there were some people there with uncivil intent? Should we forgive? Should we move forward? It seems as if everyone's still stuck in January 6th, both culturally, politically, and legally.
Yeah. Oh, man, what a great set of questions. One thing that is difficult to think about, but that I do think about, is I do think that a lot of people who were there at January 6th doing some really bad things did it out of their interpretation of love for this country. That something, there was just a completely different path that some of those folks had taken, that they began with sort of this intense love for the country. And, they saw things a certain way. They heard from certain people, and it added up to this narrative where the country was getting away from everyone and it was up to them to save it. And they were going to have to break into the US Capitol and do this thing. It was, I mean, was I traumatized? Yes. Because I think what it showed me was, oh my God, this is how far it's come. This is how bad it's gotten, but I saw the love of country. And again, I know that's controversial to say, but I do think that if you were to poll a lot of people out there, they would not say, I'm here to destroy America. They would all say they were there to save it. So that gives me hope too. I become very curious about that. How in the world did you think that you would save America by attacking it? And they would say, well, I didn't see myself as attacking it. I saw these other people as attacking it, and then you start going, you go to, it's like an onion, and you start in the middle and you go to all the layers. And it's a tough, tricky conversation. Braver Angels, one of our podcasts we did an interview with two folks from the Braver Angels community who were at the rally, did not participate in the riots, were not at the Capitol, did nothing wrong, but were at the rally and could share their perspective, their enthusiasm, for Trump and for the conservative movement, and could also share their disappointment, like severe disappointment, with where it ended. And but it's like, what is it that we see? We look at January 6th, and if we see total unquestionable evil, then we're not looking hard enough.
Monica, finally, this season 4 of How to Fix Democracy, as I explained at the beginning, is focusing on democracy in America. Our first show was about Alexis de Tocqueville and his 19th century journey to America, an analysis of democracy in America, which of course has become a classic and made America the laboratory in the world for democracy. Given the fact that it has been the laboratory, how essential is it, not just for America, but for the rest of the world, to fix our democracy? How do we need in America to have not just fearlessly curious conversations because of our children? I know you've got 2 young children, and to maintain and save our democracy, but also for democracies around the world. How globally responsible should we be?
Oh my gosh. We got to pull out all the stops. I think one of the things that a lot of people are particularly afraid of in America is the fragility of democracy. I mean, I grew up thinking it was going to be fine the rest of my life. There wasn't really anything to worry about. The US has so much power, and our form of government is a beacon to the world and all that. I just didn't think that from within, we would we would start to unwind and untangle ourselves. I don't think it's too late at all. I have a ton of hope. But I do think this is a huge test. And coming from, I'm a dual US Mexican citizen, and I look at Mexico as a really interesting sort of, it could be like that. We could let our government go, and it could become a place with a lot less accountability, a lot less reliability, a lot fewer rights. Oh, no, thanks. No, I'm good. I would really, really, really like to keep America in these ways. So it is fragile, and it is going to take citizens to notice their own power. And I think the more that we sit back feeling resigned, the more it's going to be a self-fulfilling prophecy.